Okay, we're wrapping up our analysis of the sugyot that are found in the Dapim Samech through Samech Hey of Yevamot, which is this large section of Agadata dealing with marriage, childbirth, puravu, all those topics. So we're at the tail end of the Ein Yaakov in that section of Agadata. And today we're going to be discussing an interesting question that is brought up as part of that discussion, but it's kind of a different point, and it's a fascinating, I guess, philosophical question, which is that there are certain things that we know are good or bad, and it's pretty clear cut, right? So when it comes to certain values or ethics or morals, so there are things that objectively would say that there's little debate. There's things that are gray, you don't know if it's good or bad, and there are things that it's clear that you would say that certain things are good and certain things are bad. And the question becomes, what do you do in situations where two of those come into conflict? Which one wins out? So this is obviously halachic, comes up in halakha all the time, right? Like if you see a dead body on the side of the road and made mitzvah, that trumps, let's say, going to hear the Megillah is a famous example. Right? You have two mitzvot and one is more important than the other. So you have two things that are good, and then one, and they're both very time sensitive, and one of them trumps the other. But also in the broader meta halachic sense, there are values where you'd say, if I have one that goes against the other, which one wins? And so the example that we're going to be talking about is what the Nevi'im call, right, ha'emet v'ashalom ehavu, right, that you need to love both truth and peace. And these are two core fundamental values, is that on the one hand, right, truth is the Torah is truth, Torah emet, and truth is essential. On the other hand, peace is obviously incredibly important as well. And what do you do in situations where those two come into conflict? Which one wins out? So we'll see that actually, according to the Midrashic literature, it's actually not that much of a question, at least from the examples that I've seen and what we're going to be quoting, that peace tends to trump telling the truth. And that we have, not only is it permitted, but according to some, it's actually a requirement. We'll see that the rabbis learned it out from specific examples, and then we'll dive into the Mefarshim who try to shed more light on what those examples are coming to teach us. And in particular, we'll be dealing with the example that comes from the story in Perek Nun of Sefer Breshit, which is the story of Yaakov and his brothers after Yaakov's death. So let's see it inside in our Gemara, and then we'll take it from there. So the Gemara in Yevamot Daf Samech Hey Amud Bet says as follows: V'amar Rabbi La, Mishum Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon, Kashem she'mitzuvah l'adam lomar davar nishma, kach mitzuvah l'adam shelo lomar davar she'eno nishma. So just as there is a mitzvah to say things in the name of people you heard them from, so too there's a mitzvah not to say things in the names of people who you didn't hear them from. In other words, not to make stuff up in the names of other people. Rabbi Abba Omer Chovash Ne'emar al tochach leitz penis nacha hocheach lechacham ve'evcha. Okay, and then he says not only is it kach mitzuveh, but it's actually a requirement not to do that sort of thing, right? V'amar Rabbi Ela mishum Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon, mutar lo לאדם לשנות בדבר השלום, שנאמר אביך ציווה וכו' כה תאמרו ליוסף אנא סנה וגומר. Okay, so then he teaches that it is permissible for a person to, לשנות means to change the truth, when it comes to peace. How do we know that? Because after Yaakov dies, Yosef has a whole procession bringing him to Eretz Canaan to bury him in Me'arat HaMachpelah, and then they come back. And the brothers are afraid that now Yosef is going to take revenge on them, now that Yaakov has died, for everything that they had done to him, selling him in the pit, etc. And so they send to Yosef, and they say to Yosef in a message, Avicha tziva, your father Yaakov, who just died, had commanded, saying, Kol tomru Yosef, say to Yosef, forgive the brothers for what they had done, don't take revenge on them. And so why would that be a proof that it is permissible for a person to lie for the sake of peace? So ostensibly, the belief of Rabbi Ela here is that the brothers made that up. In other words, we don't have any record of Yaakov explicitly saying anywhere that the brothers should forgive Yosef. It's just after his death the brothers tell Yosef that Yaakov had said that. But we don't ever see a place where Yaakov says that. So the Rabbi Eliyahu here is concluding that actually Yaakov never said that. But the fact that the brothers took the license to say that, or to say to Yosef that Yaakov said that, teaches you that you're allowed to lie for the sake of peace. And here, peace being peace between the brothers, peace between Yosef and all of the brothers, to ensure the continuity of Bnei Yisrael. Rabbi Natan Omer, mitzvah. Not only is it permissible, right? Not only is it mutar, it's actually a requirement. Shneimar, he brings another source. Vayam Shmuel echelech v'shama Shaul v'hargeni. So what is this talking about? After Shaul fails with the battle of Amalek, fails to heed the word of God, and God says that I'm stripping the kingship from Shaul and I'm going to give it to somebody else, he tells Shmuel, go to the house of Yishai because I have found a king there that I want to anoint and crown. And Shmuel says to God, how can I go to this house of Yishai and anoint a new king? Shaul is still alive, Shaul is still the king. B'shema Shaul v'argani, and Shaul will hear that I'm going and he'll kill me. So leaving aside the whole question of how can Shmuel say this, right? If God commanded him to do it, shouldn't he have the faith to go and do it? So the Mefarshim deal with that. But leaving that aside, the answer that God gives Shmuel is surprising. God says to Shmuel in the next pasuk, take a eglah, take a calf, and say, go there and say that you went to make a sacrifice to God. In other words, give an excuse, make up a reason why you're going. Say that you're going to give a sacrifice, when the real reason you're going is to anoint David. So here we see it's a mitzvah, right? Because it's God himself who commanded Shmuel to lie in order to save him from Shaul. Debei Rabbi Yishmael Tana, and then the third opinion that the house of Rabbi Yishmael taught, Gadol HaShalom, greatest peace, She'af HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shina Bo. Demikar Ktiv V'Adoni Zakenu V'Tov Ktiv Ani Zakanti. Okay, so even God himself lies for the sake of peace. So it's getting more and more extreme, right? The first case said you're allowed to, and you have the brothers and Yosef. God's not involved. The second case, God commanded Shmuel to lie. And in this third case, God himself is lying. How is he lying? Because when Sarah overhears the three men telling Avram that he's going to have a child in Parshat Vayera, so Sarah laughs to herself and says, right, right, I am past childbearing age. I'm too old. I don't have the physical ability to do that anymore. And my husband Avram is too old. So she is implicating herself, why it's impossible, and Avraham. She says, I can't do it. I tell you, no, I don't have that period anymore. And then also Avram, he's too old. And then God says to Avraham, so he says, God says to Avraham, because Sarah laughed to herself. She said that to herself. But God said to Avraham, why did Sarah say that this is impossible? By saying that she is too old. And of course, that's not what she said. She said Avraham is too old. Not that she herself is too old. But God changed it so that when he told Avraham, for the sake of Shalom Bayit, for the sake of keeping peace between Avraham and Sarah, he lied for the sake of not telling Avraham that Sarah had blamed him, as it were, for being too old. So I think this third one is the most extreme, not just because God himself is lying, but also because the case is the least dramatic, the least. It's the most trivial of the three, right? In other words, worst case, Avram and Sarah would fight about it, maybe. But in the previous cases, which Shmuel's talking about saving his life, right? And in the case before that, the brothers are afraid for their life. So here, at the house of Rabbi Yishmael, it's not as though if God told Avraham what Sarah had really said, that Sarah's life would be, right? We would think that. So this one it goes even above and beyond the other two, I think. But regardless, we're going to analyze the first one, right, which is the story of the brothers, where Rabbi Eliyahu seems to think that they made up what they said in the name of Yaakov, namely that Yaakov commanded Yosef to forgive the brothers, and that is a proof that you are allowed to lie for the sake of peace. Let's look at a few midrashim, and then we'll go back to the Mefarshim and our Gemara. So the Midrash Tanchuma says something interesting. V'amar B'Shimon Bar Yochai, Gadol hu HaShalom, shedibra Torah divrei bedai b'shvil shalom. Right? Peace is great because the Torah said words of falsehood, of total total falsehood for the sake of peace. Ve'ezeh, which ones? Which is the same as what Rabbi Eli said in our Gemara. And then the Midrash continues, Ve'ein anu motzim shetziva klum mikol advarim ha'eleh. So the Midrash Tanchuma explicitly spells out what we said outside, that we don't find anywhere in the Torah that Yaakov commanded any of the things that the brothers say he commanded. Ela lefi sheyodea chasiduto shel Yosef, v'lo yachoshdo machzik oto k'shofchei damim. And the reason Yaakov, but then the question begs the question, why didn't Yaakov command that? In other words, you would think Yaakov had a vested interest in Yosef not taking revenge on the brothers after his death. So why is it conspicuously absent that Yaakov said anything about sparing the brothers or not, taking revenge on them? And the Mishnah Chuma says it's because Yaakov knew Yosef was a chassid, he was a tzaddik, and he didn't think that he would take revenge, or they would murder the brothers. He thought that he was on a higher level than that, and he wouldn't go there. I think there's actually, this is a well-reasoned, this makes sense in the sense that 17 years had passed from, first of all, the fact that Yosef didn't do anything to the brothers when they were in his control. Rather, he tricked them and did the whole episode, but in the end, he forgave them and he brought them and he sustained them for 17 years. So Yaakov, I think, had a good license to think that it's not as though now that he would die that Yosef would suddenly turn a switch and take revenge. But regardless, that kind of adds more to the opinion of Rabbi Eli of why we don't have that recorded anywhere. We're not going to go into this right now, but there's another answer as well, which is brought actually in the Psikta Rabati, which is this crazy midrash. The first time I read it changed my whole perspective on the Yosef story, which in a nutshell, what that midrash says in the Psikta Rabati, that Yaakov never found out that the brothers sold Yosef into slavery. He never knew, and onto his deathbed. And that explains, of course, why he never told the brothers to forgive Yosef, because he didn't know that they had done anything. But then that itself begs the question, how could Yaakov not have known? You'd think after he comes to Egypt, and he meets up with Yosef, the first thing he would say is, oh, it's so good to see you after 20 plus years, by the way, what happened, right? And then Yosef would have to tell him. And so the Psikta Rabati says something astonishing, which is namely that if you actually read the psukim there, Yosef and Yaakov, they first meet up, they hug each other, and yet Yosef cries on Yaakov's neck, and then they don't see each other again until Yaakov's about to die, 17 years later. And so the Psikta says that Yosef deliberately distanced himself from Yaakov during that period. And he met him for that first time, and then he removed himself entirely, because he knew that if he ever built a relationship with his father again, then he would have to eventually tear apart the family by telling Yaakov what had happened with the brothers and what the brothers had done to him. So he felt it's better for me to not rekindle my relationship with Yaakov than for me to have a relationship with him, but for it to be at the expense of the larger family. Which is, I think there's so much to unpack there. But that's not the approach that the Midrash Tanchuma is taking here, obviously. Right here it assumes that Yaakov knew what had happened, but he didn't command Yosef to forgive the brothers. He just assumed that Yosef wouldn't do anything to them. The Midrash in Breshit Rabbah records a machloket, between two rabbis. One of the opinions is a bit more famous than the other, and we'll talk a little bit about what's behind them. So Vayashav Yosef Mitzrayim. So this is after Yosef returns from burying Yaakov in Eretz Canaan, which is when the brothers are afraid that he's going to take revenge on them. Rabbi Levi, Rabbi Yitzchak. Okay, two opinions on what happened there. Rabbi Levi. So why are the question here is, why were the brothers afraid that Yosef would take revenge? Just because Yaakov died? But like we said, for 17 plus years he cared for them, provided for them. He had every opportunity in the world to take advantage, and he didn't. Why were they suddenly afraid? Something must have happened related to the death of Yaakov that made the brothers afraid that Yosef was plotting something. So Rabbi Levi says, Amar shelo zimnan l'seuda. That he didn't invite them to eat with him. That for all the 17 plus years that Yosef had always invited the brothers to eat with him, to be at the royal table. And then after Yaakov's death, Yosef suddenly stopped inviting them. So the brothers felt that something was going on. Amar Rabbi Tanchuma, v'hu lo mikaven el Hashem shamayim. Rabbi Tanchuma says, It's true Yosef did that, but he only had pure intentions. Why did he do that? Amar l'she'avar abba moshiv li l'malam Yehuda shu melech u'l'malam Reuven shu bechor. In the past, when I would have all the brothers at the meal, and I would have Yaakov as well, Yaakov would seat me in a higher place than Yehuda, even though he was a king, in a higher place than Reuven, even though he was the firstborn. So Yaakov would seat me at the head of the table, and so that was okay, because it was our father who did that. But now, it's not proper for me to sit at the head of the table, because I'm not a king and I'm not the Bechor. So in order to avoid the whole awkwardness of the situation, Yosef stopped inviting them entirely. But they didn't understand that was Yosef's perspective or thought process. They just thought that he suddenly wasn't inviting them because he wanted to take revenge on them. Yosef, right? Yosef hates us. That's the first opinion, Rabbi Yitzchak Amar, and this is the more famous, and I think the more, my opinion, this is really a really fascinating midrash. Halach ve'etzitz be'oto abor. Why did the brothers think suddenly that Yosef had a change of heart and wanted to do something to them? Because on the way back from Eretz Canaan, after the burial in Ma'arat HaMechpelah, Yosef went and he looked into the pit that he had been thrown into. Right? He went to visit Dotan and he looked in the pit. So the brothers saw that and they figured, right, Yosef still remembers, he's still thinking about the pit. He goes to look at the pit, he's sending a message, he's reminding himself of what happened here, we're in trouble. Right? Rabbi Tanchuma says Yosef's intentions were pure here. Now, what were his intentions? That you should, it's Gemara in Brachot, in the 9th parak, says you should always go back to a place where a miracle happened to you and make a blessing to Hashem. And say, thank God that I was saved from this. So Yosef, the first time that he's been back to Eretz Canaan, he's been back to Israel, to the place where he was sold, so he felt the need to take the opportunity to go and say Shevach Vodah to Hashem for saving him. But the brothers, right, for them it was just about the fact that Yosef hated them. So, just to take a 2-second tangent, like what is the idea behind this particular midrash that Yosef went and looked into the pit? Okay, what is the midrash trying to say here? So I think there's two things here, and this is like a whole shir in itself potentially. But one is that put yourself in Yosef's shoes for a second, right? That he was sold as a boy into slavery, into this pit, and then all these things happened to him. That he's descended down and down, and then he was raised up. He became a king. He provides for his whole family. He goes back. He needs that closure, right? This literally and symbolically represents the closure of Yosef, that he goes back to the pit where he was sold. That started his downfall, right? From being the favorite son of Yaakov, down into the pit, down into Egypt, down into the jail. And then he was raised up and up and up to the king, and he goes back to the pit. It all comes literally full circle. So it represents that closure that Yosef needed because he was obviously traumatized by that event. We're told that he cried out to the brothers and they didn't listen to him. He must have been mulling over what had happened for years, and it was always in the back of his mind and informed all his decisions. And so the fact that he goes back to the pit when the first time he has an opportunity to go back to the pit, of course he's going. How could he not have gone back? Right? That's what Rabbi Yitzchak is saying. Right? He had to have gone back to have that moment of clarity and closure about what had happened. And so, I think it's very powerful what this is trying to say. And the second thing I just wanted to kind of throw out, I thought of this over the weekend, and I didn't see anyone who mentions this. So I don't know if it probably doesn't make any sense, but it makes sense to me, so it has to be true. That Yosef was 17 when he got sold into slavery, right? And if you add up the years, we're told he was 30 when he was brought before Paro. Then there were 7 years of plenty and 2 years of famine until Yaakov and the brothers came down after 2 years of the famine, which means Yosef was 30 plus 7 plus 2, 39 years old when the family came down. And then 17 years until Yaakov died, right? Yaakov was in Goshen for 17 years and then he passed away. So that means this whole episode of going to visit Eretz Canaan and burying Yaakov happened when Yosef was 39 plus 17, which is 56 years old. Which is basically 40 years after he was sold into slavery. Because he was 17 when he was thrown to the pit, and he's 56 when Yaakov dies. And so what that means is he was sold into Galus when he was 17 years old, and he was in Egypt for 40 years, and the first time he goes back to Eretz Canaan is 40 years later. Now, of course, it's only for a short period to bury his father, and then he goes back to Egypt, but symbolically, perhaps the idea is one of redemption, galus and redemption, in the person of Yosef. And again, this is just an idea I had. I don't know if anyone says this, but perhaps Rabbi Yitzchak is somehow alluding to this idea as well, that right, Maseh Avot Simon Labanim, that Yosef's whole story is a story of galus and redemption, right, going all the way down and then coming up, and the closure of that, the final stage of that redemption is when he himself goes to Eretz Canaan, right? That he leaves Egypt and goes to Canaan to bury Yaakov. That is him leaving Galus and going back to Eretz Canaan. And the fact that it happened after 40 years, of course, perhaps parallels the fact that it took Bnei Israel 40 years to leave Egypt and go to Eretz Canaan as well. But the idea being that going and looking at the pit represents the fulfillment of that cycle of Galut v'Geula. So that's one idea around this Medrash in Bereishit Rabbah. But again, what we're trying to do is shed light on the idea of, here too, it seems we're trying to understand why the brothers made up what they made up, right? That all these Midrashim have a common thread. They think that the brothers had invented. It's not that Yaakov had actually said that and the Torah doesn't tell us, but no, the brothers dafka lied, and the reason they lied was for the sake of peace. And that it was permissible, mutar, as Rabbi Ilah said. Let's go back now to a couple of the Mefarshim on our Gemara. So if we look at the Rif says something a bit kind of tangential, but it's worth noting. He says as follows: Mותר לאדם לשנות. Right, a person's allowed to lie for the sake of peace. Okay, Tema. It's a question. שמביא ראיה מדכתיב כה תאמרו ליוסף וכו' והלא מדכתיב אביך ציווה ולא מצינו שציווה משם ראיה שמותר לשנות וכן במדרש רבה מה הייתי להם מהתם שנאמר אביך ציווה וכן בפירוש שיזהר בתורה כתיב אביך ציווה ולא מצינו שציווה אלא שמותר לשנות פני השלום. The question here basically is that if we look at the Midrashim, that the problem they have, let me see that here, is that they say that the issue, that the pasuk that they're referring to is that, excuse me one second, right, that the pasuk that they say that it says Ko tomru li Yosef anasana pesha, right, that the problem is this one, right, Ko tomru li Yosef anasana pesha, but what about the fact that it opens and says Vavicha tziva? In other words, the question is, why is the question on the fact that they said the specific lie of, oh, you have to tell Yosef to forgive, versus the fact that Yaakov commanded anything, right? Not the specific lie, but the fact that Yaakov said anything was a lie. So why did the Midrashim all raise the question on the specific lie of the Ko Tomru li Yosef and not on the Avicha Tziva, which is the general command? Because that in and of itself was a lie. And so what the Rif answers, if we just skip, he asks a couple more questions, but his answer to that first question is, in my humble opinion, to Rabbi Eli, Dorish hai krad he'asfu v'agid elachem et asher yikareh b'acharit hayamim. That when Yaakov is on his deathbed, he gathers all the tribes and he blesses all of the tribes, or all of his sons, and he says to them, gather together and I'll tell you what will happen in the end of days. He'asfu, gather together. Shut tzivui, right? That's a command. He'asfu, you have to gather. So again, pshat is it's this poetic, they're all gathered there, and it's this poetic kind of concept of, I'm going to tell you what will happen to all the tribes in the end of the days. But here he's interpreting it as a drasha that it means literally you have to gather. What does that mean to gather? Right? Gather in from your feud and become one family unit. Become the 12 tribes of Israel. And that was an actual command that Yosef gave on his death, and Yaakov gave on his deathbed. And if that's the case, then when the brothers, after Yaakov's death, sent to Yosef and said, your father commanded us and said, forgive Yosef for the sin, to tell Yosef to forgive the brothers for their sin. So the fact that the brothers said, your father commanded, was the truth. He did command them. He commanded them not to fight and become one family unit. And that his intent, Yaakov's intent there, was that it's true Yosef is king of Egypt and the brothers are the brothers, but the command to Yosef was that you should act as one unit. He wanted Yosef not to lord over them like a king, but to be as though he was one of the brothers. And that was what Yaakov intended in his Tziva Yosef. And if that's the case, then you can't prove from Avicha Tziva the brothers lied for the sake of peace, because they were telling the truth because Yaakov had actually commanded Yosef something. כי באמת דיברו שכך ציווה אביהם. ואין להוכיח ששינו מפני השלום, אלא ממאמרם זה כה תאמרו ליוסף. והרי לא אמר כדברים האלה. ומכאן ששינו מפני השלום. And so he concludes, and therefore, that's the reason the Midrashim specifically quote כה תאמרו ליוסף, and not Avicha Tziva, because even if I have the drasha that Avicha Tziva literally happened and it meant that Yosef should gather in from the machloket and act like the rest of the brothers, for sure it didn't mean what Kot Tamru Yosef means, which is that the command was specifically to Yosef to forgive the brothers for what they had done to him all those years ago. So that's just kind of the Rif being extra sharp in the language of the Midrashim's question. And then if we look at the Iyun Yaakov on our sugya, he has something interesting to say as well. He says the following: Shnema Avicha Tziva, Ein b'Maharsha. Okay, so Masha Katav b'zeh. Okay, we're not going to look at that. Val Perish Hadrash Amarti, and the Iyun Yaakov says, and now I'm going to say based on Drash the following: Zilakach Chashdu Echav Yosef. So if you remember, all the Midrashim we looked at previously were trying to answer the question of why the brothers were suddenly afraid that Yosef was Luis Timen Yosef. Suddenly he was going to take revenge on them. Right? And Rabbi Levi said it's because he didn't invite them to the meal anymore. And Rabbi Yitzchak says because he went and he looked at the pit. But the Iyun Yaakov says maybe there's another reason. He says that they saw that their father had died, and that resembled the beginning of the shiabud. That was the moment that Yaakov died was the beginning of Galus. Because we know, based on a different midrash, that the Galus actually started once Yaakov died. That's when the harshness started setting in. That's when the slavery. That's when the Galus started. Right? And it says in Esther Rabbah, on the pasuk where Yosef says to the brothers, don't be sad of everything that happened because God sent me before you to sustain you in Egypt. So the Medrash there says, Amar Rabbi Yisachar, Uma mi shemochel veomer lo atem shelachtem afilu hachinen shuv nishtabdu b'mitzrayim mi she'eno mochel achar kama v'kama. Rabbi Yisachar says, Yosef forgave the brothers. He told the brothers, I forgive you for what you did. You don't have to be nervous. And even so, the Galus happened and all the suffering and all the pain and they were stuck in Egypt. Even though they were forgiven for their sin, the sin that they did of selling Yosef into Egypt still started the Galus, and Yosef forgiving them didn't help. So Rabbi Yisachar says, learn from here, someone who sins against someone else and the other person doesn't forgive him, how much worse is it? In other words, if the brothers were forgiven and they still had to go into Galus and all the terrible things happened, the slavery, etc. So someone who's not forgiven, kal v'chomer. That's what that midrash says. And then the question on that midrash is, why didn't Yosef's forgiveness work? Or why wasn't that enough? Or why wasn't the fact that Yosef forgave the brothers enough to say that the sin of Mechirat Yosef was forgiven, and therefore the whole idea that the sin of Mechirat Yosef led to the Galut, well, they were forgiven, so why wasn't that forgiveness on Yosef's part enough to prevent the Galut? So Tzarech Lomar al Da'at Ita B'Perek Gimel de Brachot. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Kol mesaper achar emet ki'ilu mesaper achar even. Right, the way we can answer it is based on a Gemara in Brachot, which says as follows. Note this is Rabbi Yitzchak, just as Rabbi Yitzchak was the one who says that Yosef looked at the pit. Anyone who speaks ill of a dead person, it's as though he speaks ill of a stone. Basically saying that the dead people don't have ears. There's no repercussions to speaking ill of the dead. Once someone's dead, you don't have to be afraid of anything happening based on the fact that you're speaking ill of the dead. They're dead, and that's it. Right? And there's some that say it's not that they're dead so they don't hear. No, they hear, right? Their neshamas hear or whatever, but they don't care because they're dead. They don't care about gossip or their name and in this world. Ini, the Gemara says that's so. Ve'amar of Papa chad ishtai batre damar shmuel v'nafal kanya mimetalila ubezaye le'arnaka democha. Which basically means, but didn't Rav Papa teach one time somebody said something negative about Shmuel, after he had died, and then a beam, something fell off of the roof and struck him in his skull and crushed his skull. Meaning the fact that he said something negative about Shmuel, even though Shmuel was dead, the roof collapsed and like a log fell on his head and crushed his skull. Doesn't that show that you can't speak ill of the dead? And the Gemara answers there, Shani Tzurba Mirabanan. The Kadosh Baruch Hu Tava Biyakrei. It's different when you're one of the Tzurba Derabanan, when you're one of the Talmidei Chachamim, because then God Himself avenges your honor. Right? So even though the dead don't hear or don't care, so Shmuel himself, he's dead. It doesn't matter what you say about him. You could say the worst thing in the world. It doesn't matter. But God is still around, and God still cares about the honor of His Talmidei Chachamim, and so God will take revenge. And so concludes the Iyun Yaakov, Al Korchach v'im ken yesh lomar gam ken v'Yosef, sheyat tzurba merabanan. So Yosef, of course, would be considered one of the tzurba merabanan, one of the greats. T'kedichtiv ki ben skunim, right? There's a midrash that says when he's referred to as ben skunim, that means that he was a Talmid Chacham. V'afal pi shehu machal. So even if Yosef himself forgave the brothers for the fact that they sold him into slavery, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Tava Biyakrei, God is still going to avenge Yosef's honor. Yaakov's honor, excuse me. Ve'im ken kach Yosef's honor. Ve'im ken kach kavanat pasuk v'yir'u ki met avihem u'miyad yitchil tzarat ha'shiabud. Ala b'datan shevadai lo machal lahem b'lev shalem. So the brothers thought that Yosef hadn't forgiven them with a whole heart. Dim lo ken lama nem shu. Because if not, why were they suffering already after Yaakov's death? In other words, they thought if Yosef had forgiven them that they wouldn't be suffering, but they saw that they were. And that's why they're afraid that Yosef is taking revenge on them. And his response to them was, no, I forgive you with a full heart, a full forgiveness. But the fact that the gullus has begun, he quotes, the Iyun Yaakov cleverly here quotes Yaakov's language of Atachat Elokim Ani, saying Yosef saying to the brothers, I'm not instead of God, Ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu Tava Biyakrei. I can forgive you, but what you did is still unforgivable in the eyes of God. And so if I forgive you, God still wants to avenge my honor, as it were. And so the galus is still going to begin. So we just saw here an interesting kind of take of the Iyun Yaakov on the whole episode of why the brothers were afraid that Yosef was lying. So just to kind of conclude, we saw in our Gemara the reason of why we're allowed to lie for the sake of peace. One of the opinions was that the brothers lied. And then we saw various midrashim that none of them were questioning if the brothers lied, but they gave different reasons for why they lied, or what they were afraid of. We saw Bereshit Rabbah that Yosef didn't invite them to the feast, or that he looked at the pit, or the Iyun Yaakov, which that he did, that he forgave them, but the shiabud began, that they already started to suffer at that point. And so the brothers saw Yosef hadn't forgiven them. Whatever the reason was, the brothers decided to act, and they felt licensed to lie for the sake of peace, to maintain peace between them and between Yosef, and to save their own lives, obviously. And so from there, Rabbi Eli learns that Mותר Ladan לשנות בדבר השלום. עד כאן.
שכוח רן.
שכוח.
Ron, how's Sarah?